The lights went dark, and nobody knew Michael Jackson had cried for the very last time that night. Los Angeles, June 24th, 2009. It was well past midnight. The massive stage of Staples Center was cluttered with equipment bags and cables left behind from the rehearsal that had packed the room just hours before. The spotlights were still on. Most of the crew had gone home. A few voices murmured somewhere in the back corridors. And in the middle of that stage, in those unmistakable white socks, stood a man. Alone. Michael Jackson. He was holding a small bottle of water, but he wasn't drinking, just holding it. His eyes weren't on the stage. They were somewhere else entirely. Those eyes, the ones that billions of people had watched for decades, were staring at nothing. Nobody saw him cry that night, but someone heard him. Let's go back a few hours, 8:47 p.m. This was one of the final rehearsals for the This Is It tour. Kenny Ortega was rushing back and forth across the stage. Dancers were locking into position. Lighting technicians were shouting into their headsets. And Michael. Michael was standing at the edge of the stage, arms folded, eyes closed. The moment the music started, everything changed. The first two sequences were flawless. On the third, Michael stopped. His hand froze in midair. Ortega rushed over. "Michael, you okay?" Michael lifted his head. That smile was there, the famous one. But this time, it didn't reach his eyes. "Encore," he said quietly. "One more time." The dancers exchanged glances. They had already run that same sequence 20 times hours ago, but no one said a word. When Michael Jackson said encore, you ran it again. But here's what was truly shocking, the real reason Michael stopped that night, and for years, no one could fully explain it. Let's go back further. Tokyo. Michael Jackson was in the middle of a world tour, and every night, hundreds of thousands of people waited hours just to see him. This was Michael at his peak. The Bad album was breaking records. His name was spoken in every language on earth. His face hung on every wall, and he was crying alone in hotel rooms. When you first hear that, it's hard to believe. The most famous man in the world, selling out the biggest arenas, was falling apart behind closed doors. But this was the most painful truth of Michael Jackson's story. The stage was both his salvation and his prison. Someone who was close to him during that era said it years later. Michael would see you from the stage, thousands of people. Then the show would end, and he'd walk into his room and close the door, and those thousands of people would just disappear. All that was left was silence. Silence. Michael Jackson's greatest enemy wasn't noise. It was silence. That was the year everything began to shift. Up until then, Michael had offered the world something like a fairy tale. A little boy from Gary, Indiana, who grew up in music and conquered the world. Neverland Ranch, animals, carnival rides, open doors for children who'd never seen a theme park in their lives. All of it a reflection of the childhood he never got to have. But in 1993, the media started tearing that fairy tale apart. Allegations, reports, headlines, a new story every single day. While Michael Jackson was shaking the world was shaking him apart. So what was he doing through all of it? He kept rehearsing. He kept writing songs. And he kept crying. This is the moment everything changed, because Michael was no longer just an artist. He had become a target. Those great white gates at Neverland, massive, majestic, gates that carried you into another world the moment you passed through them. Michael had them built not for himself, but for children, sick children, children in poverty, children who'd never once seen a place like that. But over time, those gates came to stand for something else: isolation. The world outside was judging him. Inside, Michael was trying to return to the childhood he'd lost inside the paradise he'd built. There were train tracks running through the garden, a giraffe, a carousel. And at night, Michael would wander through that park alone. Alone. The man with millions of fans. Alone. When Invincible came out, Michael no longer looked the same to the outside world, at least from the outside. But the moment he walked into a studio, he was exactly the same Michael. Rodney Jerkins worked with him during that period. He told a story years later. Michael would come into the studio and sit there for hours working on a single sound. I'd say, "I'm done." He'd say, "One more time." I'd say, "That's perfect." He'd say, "No, not yet." Perfectionism. It was his power, and it was his chain. A man who wouldn't stop until every note in every song was right. A body that wouldn't tire until every movement in every dance was perfect. And that relentless pursuit was wearing down his body while it wore down his soul. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, because that same perfectionism would be the force that both pulled him onto the stage in 2009 and slowly pulled him away from it. The trial. You know this chapter. But there's something you don't know. Throughout the trial, Michael showed up to court every morning, in front of cameras, in front of reporters, and every night he returned to the hotel. A security guard who was with him during that time told this story. He'd get back to the room and close the door and put music on. Not his own music, classical music, for hours. Hours of classical music. Maybe to escape, maybe just to feel like he existed. The day the not guilty verdict was read, Michael cried. But whether those tears came from relief or from everything he'd been carrying for years finally breaking through the surface, that no one can say for certain. 3 silent years. The media said Michael was finished. Some of his closest circle had drifted away. He had been forced to give up Neverland. And during these years, Michael lived in foreign cities under different names, to avoid being recognized. Think about that for a moment. One of the most recognizable faces in the world, desperately trying not to be recognized. What a lonely place that must have been. Don't miss this, because those 3 silent years were the exact thing that made the 2009 comeback both miraculous and tragic. Early 2009. The announcement came, "This is it. 50 concerts, London, the O2 Arena." Tickets sold out in minutes. Millions of people wanted Michael back, and Michael was preparing to return. But was he really ready? During rehearsals, the dancers noticed something. On stage, Michael lit up with an energy that belonged to a completely different world. When Billie Jean played, when Thriller kicked in, the old Michael was right there. Those movements, that presence, that magnetism. Nothing had been lost. But when the music stopped, Michael shrank. He'd fold his arms, go quiet, his eyes drifting somewhere far away. Kenny Ortega approached him one afternoon at the edge of the stage. "How are you, Michael?" he asked. Michael smiled, that famous smile. "I'm ready," he said. What stuck with Ortega was this. The question was, "How are you?" Not, "Are you ready?" But Michael had given the same answer to both. By mid-June, the rehearsals had become relentless. Every night at Staples Center. Hours of repetition. And every night, Michael pulled a little further inside himself. One evening, the rehearsal had ended. Dancers were heading to the dressing rooms. The crew was dispersing, and one spotlight was still burning, exactly where Michael always stood and stared. An assistant approached him. "Car's waiting, Michael. Ready to go?" Michael kept looking at that light, a long moment. Then he turned. One more minute. That one more minute stretched. And then Michael stood there, alone, in the middle of the empty stage, under that single light. Nobody knows what he was thinking in that moment. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. You won't believe this, but what happened in the final hours of that last rehearsal on June 24th, 2009, would still be talked about years later. Past 11 p.m. The stage was nearly empty now. A couple of technicians, one security guard, and Michael was still there. The security guard, he never gave his name, but he told the story, saw Michael sit down at the corner of the stage, not on the floor, on a road case at the edge, and he pulled his knees up to his chest, like a small child, on that enormous, glowing, magnificent stage, like a small child, and he wept. The guard didn't approach. "I didn't want to disturb him," he would say later. It felt like he was saying goodbye, not to anyone, to the stage, to himself. I don't know, but that's how it felt, saying goodbye. That night, Michael returned to his home on Carrollwood Drive. It was 2 a.m. The next day, June 25th, 2009, an ambulance was called before noon, and the world changed. But let's go back to that night, that last rehearsal, those tears, because here is what really matters. Michael Jackson spent 50 years offering the world perfection. Every note, every step, every performance. And in return, what did the world give him? It judged him. It consumed him. And then it mourned him. I think about that night, the empty stage, the single spotlight, and the weight that man was carrying on his shoulders. Everything accumulated over decades, every headline, every courtroom morning, every misunderstanding, every night alone in those Neverland rooms. But what you've seen so far is nothing, because behind those tears, there was something that perfectionist man had never told anyone for years. Kenny Ortega, in an interview years later, said this: "On that final rehearsal night, Michael said something to me with his eyes, not with words. He just looked at me. And in that look, there was both, okay, I'm ready, and something else. Something I still can't quite put into words. Was it readiness? Or was it farewell? Perhaps both." Michael Jackson saw the stage as home his entire life. Real life was too brutal. The media, the courtrooms, the loneliness. But the stage was different. On the stage, no one judged him. On the stage, millions loved him, and he loved them back. And on that night, in that final rehearsal, when he said goodbye to that stage, maybe he wasn't saying goodbye to the stage. Maybe he was saying goodbye to the rest of it. This is it. That was the name of the tour. But maybe it was also a truth Michael had been quietly whispering to himself. This is it. Enough has been given. Enough pain has been endured. Enough reaching for the impossible perfection. This is it. Everyone who was there that night, the dancers who rehearsed with him, the people who were nearby in those final hours, they all say the same thing. Michael was different that night, both very far away and very close. One of the dancers described what happened after they finished the Thriller sequence. She went over to Michael afterward. "Was that good?" she asked. Michael looked at her. He smiled, and he said, "That was everything. Just that. That was everything." The next day, the world heard the news. The king of pop was gone, and millions wept. But that security guard felt something different. "I had already cried the night before," he said. "Not for him. With him. For that man sitting in the corner of the stage with his knees pulled up, because in that moment I understood. He was never just a star. His whole life, all he ever wanted was to be understood, to be loved, to simply exist. To simply exist. The man loved by millions simply wanted to exist. And just when you thought it was over, this is the real shock. As Michael was leaving the stage that final night, he turned to a young dancer. She had just joined the tour lineup. She was still trembling with nerves. Michael looked at her. "Don't be afraid," he said. "The audience doesn't see you. They feel you. And if you truly feel it, they will too." Then he turned and walked away. That dancer carried those words for the rest of her life. And every time she walked on stage, every time the spotlights found her, every time she closed her eyes, she heard Michael's voice. "Don't be afraid." That's why the lights never really went out. That's why the stage is still waiting. That's why the music never stopped. Because Michael Jackson taught us the hardest lesson of all. Real art means giving everything, even in a world that doesn't understand you. And he gave everything, until his very last breath. In every note, in every step, in every tear, even when the lights went dark. The greatest education in the world is watching the masters at work. Michael Jackson.